Ever had to confront someone older than you and stand your ground?
When your own mother tells you, flat out, no hesitation, to stay quiet at your brother's engagement dinner, to please not make it about you, that's when you realize something's been rotting beneath the surface for a long, long time. The words didn't just sting, they slid in like tiny shards, silent and sharp, hitting places in me I didn't know were still bleeding. I didn't say anything back. I just stood there in the hotel bathroom, blinking at her reflection in the mirror behind me, and nodded like a good daughter should, like I'd done since I was old enough to understand that in our house, being heard was a privilege you had to earn. And no matter how hard I tried over the years, I never quite earned it. The dinner was at this fancy little private dining room in a boutique hotel, marble bar, antique chandeliers, custom menu cards with Daniel and Julia's names embossed in gold. It looked like something out of a Pinterest board for people who say curated instead of planned. Daniel was glowing, Julia was smiling that picture-perfect smile she always had, and my parents were already 2 glasses of wine into the evening when I arrived, as if their nerves couldn't face the possibility of an unfiltered conversation with their grown children. I sat near the end of the table, not quite at the edge, not quite central either, where they always kept me, figuratively and now literally. Daniel was holding court at the head, joking with the waitstaff, flashing that same charming smirk he's been perfecting since high school. He's the kind of guy who knows exactly when to laugh at your joke and exactly when to pretend he didn't hear it, depending on whether or not you're useful to him. People love him until they don't. But most people never get to that part. I kept my mouth shut through the appetizers, through the clinking of glasses, through the fawning stories our mom told about how Daniel always had a good heart, even as a little boy. She laughed at the time he lied about flushing a toy down the toilet and flooded the second floor of our house. That story always comes up. What never does? The part where I got blamed for it, grounded for 2 weeks, and missed my 3rd grade field trip to the science museum I'd been begging to go to for months. But that's always been the thing with my family. Daniel's mistakes were memories. Mine were warnings. I didn't plan to say anything. Truly. I had promised myself I wouldn't make waves, because I'd already been warned. 2 days before, Mom called me, completely unprompted, just to remind me that this dinner was important and that I should be gracious. That was the word she used. Gracious. Like I was some bitter old maid who might bring a storm cloud to the table. She didn't say that directly, of course. But she didn't have to. Moms like mine are masters of the passive slice. And so I sat, swirling my wine, practicing silence like it was a sport. My fingers trembled just a little under the table when Julia reached for Daniel's hand, her eyes sparkling as she leaned forward to make her toast. It was all very polite, very choreographed. She stood up and tapped her spoon against the side of her champagne flute, the soft metallic ring pulling everyone's attention toward her like magnets. But it wasn't her smile that stopped me cold, it was the look she gave me as she stood. Not obvious. Not loud. Just a flicker of something. Recognition. A question. Maybe guilt. Or maybe warning. I didn't know yet, and it was that not knowing that made my chest tighten. She held the glass, cleared her throat, and gave a sweet, typical speech at first, how grateful she was, how lucky she felt, how much Daniel meant to her. And then she paused. And she looked around the table, her voice dropping just slightly. And she said, I think it's time we talk about what kind of man Daniel really is. That's when the air went still. Not dramatically, just enough that you noticed the absence of movement. My fork hovered over my plate. My mom's wine glass stopped mid-tilt. Even the waiter, who had been clearing plates, froze for a beat like someone had pressed pause on the whole room. Daniel laughed, lightly, like she was teasing. That's how he deflects things. Pretend it's a joke and you're halfway to convincing everyone else it was. But she didn't laugh back. She just held her glass, one hand resting gently on the table, and kept speaking. There's more to this man than most people know, she said, still smiling faintly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. And tonight feels like the right time to say it. I felt heat rising in my chest. Not just from the wine, but from something deeper, rage, maybe. Or dread. Because I knew that tone in her voice. I had heard it once before. A long time ago. And it didn't lead anywhere good. But before she could go further, my mother leaned over to me, so close I could smell her perfume, same one she's worn for 30 years, and hissed, "Tessa, please, don't make this about you." I turned toward her, slow and deliberate, my voice steady and low. I didn't say a word. Not yet, anyway. And that's when Julia clinked her glass again, softly, like punctuation, and said something that made the room stop breathing altogether. "Actually, it's about time everyone knew what kind of man he really is." And just like that, the forks froze midair. You know, people always act like family stories have a clean beginning, that there's a moment when things started to go wrong, when someone made the first mistake, when the line between right and wrong got crossed. But in my family, it was never that simple. Because it didn't start with a blowout or a betrayal. It started with the small things, the things nobody talks about because they feel too petty to mention, the sideways glances, the silences that stretched too long, the way the room would tilt just slightly in Daniel's favor no matter what the topic was, and over the years, those little shifts stacked up like bricks, until the walls were built so high that I couldn't even see over them anymore. I used to think I was imagining it, that maybe I was being overly sensitive, that maybe he wasn't really trying to edge me out of every space we shared, but it's funny how hindsight has a way of sharpening everything. Especially once you stop trying to explain away someone else's behavior out of loyalty or guilt or some twisted sense of family honor. And if I'm being honest, and I promised myself I would be this time, then I have to admit that the real fracture started not with a lie or a betrayal, but with something more complicated and much harder to admit. I used to love Julia too. Not in the way Daniel did, and certainly not in the way she eventually claimed to love him, but in the quiet, intense, almost accidental way that love sometimes slips in between two people when nobody's watching, when friendship blurs into something deeper. And you don't even realize it until it's too late to unfeel what you're feeling. We met at college, freshman orientation, to be exact, and from the start, Julia was one of those people who made you feel seen without even trying, someone who listened not because she was waiting to talk, but because she genuinely wanted to know who you were. We were inseparable that first year. Study partners, late-night coffee run companions, secret keepers. There was a week in sophomore year, during spring break, when most of our dorm had emptied out and the campus felt like a ghost town, when Julia and I spent almost every waking hour together, talking about everything and nothing, dancing in our socks to bad 90s music, drinking cheap wine out of mugs because we didn't own proper glasses, and somewhere in the middle of that strange little week, something shifted between us. We never kissed, never said anything out loud, but it was there in the glances that lasted too long, in the touches that lingered on arms and shoulders, in the way we stopped referring to boys as often, like they had slowly started to become irrelevant. But then Daniel came to visit. It was supposed to be for 2 days, just passing through on his way to a conference or a weekend with friends. I don't even remember anymore, but by the time he left, everything was different. Julia started pulling away, just a little at first, canceling plans, skipping our usual coffee runs, suddenly too busy to stay up late and talk, and I told myself it was just school pressure, that midterms were getting to her. That maybe I had imagined the whole thing. And then one day I saw them walking across campus, too close, laughing like they'd known each other forever, her hand grazing his arm, his smile too wide. A week later, they were officially seeing each other. To say I felt betrayed doesn't even scratch the surface of what I felt. It wasn't just about Julia choosing him, it was about him knowing exactly what he was doing and doing it anyway. He had met her once, maybe twice, before that spring break, but I'd spoken about her at home, shared stories, probably too many of them, and Daniel had always had a way of sniffing out what mattered to me and making it his. Like he couldn't stand the idea of me having something that wasn't his first. But of course, I said nothing. What could I say? They were dating now, and I was just the bitter sister who couldn't let go. And Mom, God, my mother practically threw a parade when she found out. "Julia's so poised," she said, "and good for Daniel. You should take notes." It wasn't even subtle. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, where every part of you wants to scream, but you're stuck behind soundproof glass. So I did what I always did. I backed off. I swallowed it. I let them be happy, or whatever their version of happy was, and I told myself that it didn't matter, that I'd move on, that maybe I had imagined it all anyway. But the thing is, people don't stay quiet because they don't have something to say. They stay quiet because they've been taught, again and again, that speaking only makes things worse. And that's exactly what my family taught me. Don't stir the pot. Don't air dirty laundry. Don't ruin a good thing, even if it was never good for you. So when Julia clinked her glass at that dinner and said, "I think it's time we talk about what kind of man Daniel really is," I knew, without a shadow of doubt, that the history we never spoke of was about to crawl out from whatever dark, silent place we'd buried it in. And maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't have to be the one to dig it up. There are moments in life that don't feel like they're happening in real time, but rather like they're unfolding just outside the reach of your body, as if you're watching from some distant, detached version of yourself, unable to move or speak or breathe correctly. And that's exactly what it felt like in that pristine, overpriced hotel dining room, with everyone sitting around the long mahogany table, half-eaten filet mignons cooling on delicate porcelain, and Julia standing there, champagne, flute in one hand and a soft, measured voice slicing through the carefully manicured atmosphere like a surgeon's blade. You could hear the quiet clatter of silverware stilling, forks hovering midair, drinks halted mid-sip, and somewhere near the kitchen doors, a server actually took a step backward, as if the force of what was about to be said had reached him already. And I, sitting there frozen, already knowing on some gut level, instinctive frequency that this wasn't going to be just some light-hearted anecdote or tender speech about Daniel's childhood quirks or his supposedly noble heart, felt something both terrifying and electric rise in my chest, the possibility that for once, I wasn't going to be the one left holding the weight of an unspeakable truth in silence. Julia didn't falter. Not once. She just stood straighter, her eyes scanning the room not for effect, but because she needed to look each of them in the face, my mother, my father, Daniel, and yes, me too, before she said what she came to say. "I know this might not be the toast anyone was expecting," she began, her voice steady but not cold, "but I think some things deserve to be said while everyone is present and paying attention, and not whispered about later behind closed doors." Daniel let out a nervous laugh, the kind of strained, high-pitched chuckle that says I don't like where this is going, but I'm still pretending to be in control, and leaned forward slightly, trying to cut her off before she gained momentum. Like he always did when someone dared to challenge the image he had so carefully cultivated for decades. "Jules," he said with that faux gentle tone, "maybe we can save the big speech for later, huh? Everyone just got their food and—" She cut him off with a single look. And that, more than any words, was when I realized she wasn't bluffing. She wasn't posturing. She was here for blood. "Before I agreed to marry Daniel," she said, still not raising her voice, still perfectly composed, "I asked myself a question that I think most people don't bother asking anymore, or maybe they just don't want to. Do I really know the person I'm about to spend my life with? Not just the version he shows me, or the one his family loves, or the one that shows up in Instagram photos, but the real version. The man behind the mirror." You could feel the discomfort ripple across the table like heat from a vent. My mother stiffened. My father looked down at his plate, and Daniel leaned back in his chair with that carefully curated grin of his faltering just enough to reveal the cracks underneath. Julia looked at him for a long moment, so long it became almost unbearable, and then turned to the rest of the table. What kind of man cheats on his partner while she's helping plan his proposal party? What kind of man lies about work trips that are actually weekends with someone else? What kind of man tells different versions of the same story, depending on who's listening, just to make sure he always comes out on top? My mother gasped, not because she was shocked about the cheating, though perhaps she was, but because Julia had the audacity to bring it up here, now, in public, in front of the family and the waitstaff and the flickering candles. To her, the betrayal wasn't the crime, the speaking of it was. Daniel's face changed then. The smile dropped completely, and the tension in his jaw pulsed like a live wire. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice lower, darker. "Are you seriously doing this now?" Julia nodded, calm as ever, and took a slow sip from her glass. "Yes, I am." Because for once, I'm not going to help protect a narrative that only benefits you. She set the glass down on the table with a deliberate clink that echoed louder than it should have. And if we're really going to pretend we care about truth and family and what matters, then let's start with the fact that I wasn't the first person you proposed to. That sentence, more than anything that had come before, sent a visible shudder through the room. My father cleared his throat as if to speak, but no words came. My mother, her face an alarming shade of pale pink, looked at Julia and then at me, something dawning behind her eyes that I wasn't ready for. Daniel barked out a laugh then, like a man cornered in a dream where nothing makes sense. "What the hell are you talking about?" he said. "I didn't propose to anyone else." "That's insane." But Julia was already reaching into her bag. She pulled out her phone, scrolled for a second, then placed its screen up in the center of the table, just in front of my father's untouched plate. "She said no," Julia said quietly. "But he asked." And that was when all eyes turned to me. It took a second for the words to catch up to the looks, and by the time they did, I felt every muscle in my body stiffen. There was a beat of absolute, suffocating silence, the kind that doesn't just fall over a room but settles in people's lungs, keeping them from even breathing. I could see the disbelief in my mother's expression, but it wasn't the kind of disbelief rooted in shock. It was the kind people wear when they've already decided not to believe you before you even open your mouth. "I didn't say anything," I said softly, not defensively, not even trying to plead my case, because what was the point? Daniel leaned forward, face flushed, suddenly animated. "Oh, come on, Tess. Are we really going to pretend like you didn't have some twisted little obsession with me and Julia? You were always weird about us. You tried to turn her against me. You couldn't stand the fact that she picked me." My hands were trembling under the table now, hidden beneath the linen napkin I had clutched too tightly. "You proposed to me first," I said, my voice low but even. 2 years ago. In your car. After Julia had broken up with you the first time." Julia blinked, and I saw it. The realization, the missing puzzle piece falling into place, the confirmation of whatever gut instinct had brought her here tonight. "You said you never cheated," she said to Daniel, not angry now, just tired. "You said she was making it up." "She is making it up," Daniel said too quickly. "She's always wanted to tear me down. She's jealous. She's bitter. She's telling the truth," Julia said quietly, and the room fell silent again. And then, with everyone watching, I reached into my purse, pulled out an old envelope, and slid it across the table toward Julia. On the back, in fading handwriting, were the words, "Don't let him tell you it's your fault." And, just like that, the silence deepened, not because the dinner had gone off the rails, not because of the secrets spilled across the linen tablecloth, but because for the first time in this family's long and well-rehearsed history of denial and deflection, the story was no longer Daniel's to control. There's something strange that happens in a moment of public unraveling, not just to the person being unraveled, but to everyone around them, because when the mask finally slips, when the story they've so carefully built begins to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, there's a collective hesitation in the air, like people aren't sure whether to look away out of politeness or lean in out of curiosity, and in that frozen tension, all the unspoken rules of civility and family dynamics start to buckle. And as I sat there, my envelope now resting in Julia's shaking hands, the contents still sealed but screaming loud enough in their implication to silence everyone, I felt a bizarre calm creeping in. The kind of calm that only comes after you've already walked through the fire and accepted that there is no path back to the person you used to be. Julia didn't open the envelope right away. She held it gently, almost reverently, like something sacred had been placed in her hands, and I saw the weight of it settle in her eyes as she turned it over, tracing her fingers across the faded handwriting, the handwriting I knew by heart. Because it belonged to our grandmother, the only person in our family who ever made me feel like I wasn't invisible. The envelope, which I'd kept hidden for years in the bottom drawer of an old jewelry box, wasn't just a letter. It was evidence. Written proof that someone, once, had seen what Daniel really was, and had tried to protect me from the fallout she knew was coming long before I ever did. My mother, still recovering from the shock of hearing Julia's accusations aloud, reached for her glass of wine with a trembling hand, though she didn't sip it. She just held it there, fingers tight around the stem, like it might ground her in a moment that was unraveling far too quickly for her liking. "Tessa," she said finally, her voice clipped and full of warning, "this isn't the time." I turned to her slowly, measured, because I wanted her to hear every word. "Isn't it, though?" I asked, and my voice didn't shake, not anymore. Because I've spent my entire life waiting for the right time to speak, the right moment to tell the truth, the perfect opportunity where it wouldn't cause a scene or make you uncomfortable. And all that waiting just left me buried under years of silence that never protected anyone but him. Daniel scoffed, the sound sharp and bitter, like he was trying to cut through the rising tide of truth with sheer bravado. "You're unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, posture slouched into that smug, defensive stance he always adopted when he felt cornered. "This little performance of yours, it's pathetic." Julia turned to him then, slowly, and the look in her eyes made him flinch, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that I saw the flicker of doubt creep across his face. "It's not a performance," she said softly. "It's a reckoning." I watched my father out of the corner of my eye, hoping for something, anything from him. A word. A look. Some sign that he wasn't as checked out of this family as he always pretended to be. But he remained silent, staring down at the table like the wood grain might open up and swallow him whole if he stayed still long enough. Julia finally opened the envelope, unfolding the letter with the kind of slowness that felt ceremonial, like she was opening something that wasn't meant to be seen until now. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't need to. Her eyes moved across the page, and with each line, her expression shifted, bit by bit, until it settled into something heartbreakingly resolute. "She saw it," Julia whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Even back then, she saw what he was. My mother, cheeks flushed now with something more akin to fury than embarrassment, slammed her hand against the table, hard enough to make the silverware jump. "This is family," she snapped. "We don't do this in public. We don't humiliate each other like this." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a woman protecting her son, but a woman protecting the illusion of family she had clung to like a lifeline for decades, a version of events where her golden child could do no wrong, where loyalty meant silence, and where any deviation from the script was treated like betrayal. "No," I said, "we don't humiliate each other. We cover for each other. We hide things. We tell half-truths and swallow the rest, because God forbid the neighbors find out that Daniel isn't a saint and that you played your part in turning every one of his mistakes into someone else's consequence." Daniel's voice rose then, louder and harsher than before. "You're twisting everything. You're jealous, Tess, you always have been. You've resented me since we were kids, and now you're dragging Julia into this mess because you're miserable and alone." I stood. Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly stood, because I was done sitting through another one of his tirades disguised as a defense. "You proposed to me 2 years ago, Daniel. In your car after a wedding, drunk off your ass and rambling about how Julia didn't get you, how no one got you but me. You told me I'd always been the one who understood you. You tried to kiss me, and when I pulled away, you laughed and said I'd never have the guts to tell anyone because no one would ever believe me over you." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked truly afraid, but it passed quickly, replaced by that same derisive sneer he always wore when he was losing control. "And look," he said, gesturing around the room. "They still don't." But this time, he was wrong. Julia stood beside me, folding the letter carefully and placing it back in the envelope before turning to Daniel with a clarity in her voice that made everyone pause. I believed her. And I believe her now. And then, perhaps the most surprising thing of all happened. My father, quiet, passive, always more observer than participant, finally lifted his gaze from the table and looked directly at Daniel. "I believed her too," he said, simply, like it had cost him everything to say it. And that's when my mother stood, red-faced, furious, and said the line that split the room like a lightning strike in dry brush. "If you cared about this family, you wouldn't be doing this in public." There it was. The line that made everything fall into place. It was never about truth. It was never about healing. It was about performance, about image, about keeping the illusion intact no matter how many people had to be crushed under the weight of silence. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't just reclaiming my voice, I was burning the damn script. There's a peculiar kind of silence that settles in a room after something irreversible has been said, a silence not born of peace but of raw, unfiltered truth hanging thick in the air. A silence that no amount of well-mannered small talk or forced laughter can ever scrub away, and that's exactly what surrounded us after my mother's words carved through the night like a blade. She stood there, trembling with anger not because her son had been exposed for what he truly was, but because the story she'd spent her entire life weaving of a perfect family, of control masked as care, of silence dressed up as strength, had unraveled in front of her friends, her husband, her daughter, and, perhaps most unforgivably, herself. It wasn't Daniel's betrayal that broke her, it was the collapse of the performance. She didn't wait for anyone's response. She turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wood floor, and stormed out of the dining room with the kind of righteous fury that only those deeply invested in denial can muster. My father, for a moment, looked torn, caught between the wife he had always deferred to and the truth he had finally acknowledged aloud after decades of pretending not to see, but in the end, he followed her, his head low and shoulders heavy. Like a man retreating from a war he never had the stomach to fight in the first place. The door clicked shut behind them, and just like that, we were left in the hollow echo of what used to be a family celebration. Daniel stayed seated, although his eyes burned with something dangerous, something unhinged and bitter, and for a second, I genuinely wondered if he might try to twist this whole thing into some grotesque version of victimhood. If he'd find a way to claim that we had ambushed him, conspired against him, wounded him for sport. But he didn't speak. Maybe he knew there was no story left to spin, no audience left willing to clap at the end of his show. Or maybe he finally understood that even the most polished mask cracks under enough weight. Julia was still standing beside me, the letter folded back into its envelope, which she now held in her hand like a relic from a past that had long been dismissed as irrelevant. She wasn't crying, not in the traditional, cinematic sense, but I could see the glassiness in her eyes, the restrained grief that always follows clarity, the deep and aching mourning that comes not from the loss of love, but from the loss of illusion. What hurts the most, sometimes, isn't that someone fooled you, it's that you wanted so badly to believe them. The rest of the guests, distant cousins, co-workers, people whose names I barely remembered, remained quiet, uncomfortable in their chairs, their faces tight with politeness and panic, unsure of whether they were still supposed to smile, to apologize, to pretend they hadn't just witnessed the emotional equivalent of an arsonist watching his house go up in flames. No one touched their food. No one asked for dessert. And slowly, one by one, they began to file out, offering quick handshakes and sympathetic half-glances, though not one of them actually said anything that mattered. That's the thing about these kinds of moments. People don't want to pick a side, because choosing means risking being wrong, and nothing terrifies them more than the thought of being complicit in someone else's pain. Eventually, it was just the three of us, me, Julia, and Daniel, and the ghost of what could have been a normal evening if only we'd all kept pretending. Daniel finally rose from his chair, smoothing the front of his suit jacket with the same casual arrogance he wore like cologne. He looked at me with something that might have once been contempt, but now looked a lot like fear in disguise. "You'll never be more than someone's second choice," he said, each word slow, venomous and measured, not because he believed it, but because he wanted me to. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I just held his gaze long enough to let him see that his power over me had vanished, that whatever thread had once bound me to his approval had been severed beyond repair. And when he walked out, shoulders stiff, shoes loud against the wood, I didn't feel relief or triumph. I felt a hollow, aching sort of quiet, the sound of something ending. After a few moments, Julia and I sat down across from each other, both of us too drained to talk, too full to eat, and too changed to pretend we were the same women we had been at the beginning of the evening. The envelope sat between us, fragile and weighty, and I could feel the ghosts of everything we hadn't said swirling in the space between us. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, what she planned to do, whether this meant she was done with him forever, or if some part of her would still hold on to the version of him she once loved. But instead, she spoke first. "I'm leaving town," she said, her voice flat but not bitter, more like someone stating a fact than making a decision. "I booked the flight 2 days ago. I just needed to finish this before I could go." I nodded slowly, because part of me had known it the moment she stood to make her toast. Julia wasn't here to beg for change. She was here to bury the past. "Did you come to protect me?" I asked, "or to get even?" Her eyes flickered, and for a moment I saw everything, the shared history, the almost love, the betrayal, the forgiveness, the tired strength it took for her to walk through fire with me just long enough to watch it all burn. "Maybe both," she said, and that, finally, felt like the truth. I watched her go quietly, without ceremony, her heels tapping softly down the corridor like a heartbeat receding into silence, and when I was finally alone, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at her. Not even at Daniel. I was just tired. Tired of pretending, tired of waiting, tired of being the one who kept the peace in a war I never started. When I got home that night, my phone buzzed with a voicemail. It was from my mother, and it had been left 2 days before the dinner, before the toast, before the letter, before everything fell apart. Her voice was tight, clipped, and unmistakably cold. "Tessa, I don't know what's going through your head, but if you say one word to ruin this engagement, don't bother coming home again." She didn't say goodbye. She didn't ask how I was. She just issued her ultimatum and hung up like it was nothing. And as I sat in the dim light of my kitchen, her voice still echoing in the empty space, I realized the most painful truth of all, that she hadn't warned me because she was afraid something might happen. She had warned me because she knew exactly what I was capable of if I ever stopped protecting the story. So I didn't go home again. And I haven't since. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can do, the bravest, most liberating, most necessary act of all, is to finally walk away from a family that never saw you as anything more than the background noise in someone else's story. And maybe, just maybe, that's where my story finally begins.